My name is Doug Cook. I'm the Education Events Coordinator here at NOFA Mass. We are excited to learn more about municipal planning for food access with Faye Mack and Sarah Danley. And before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors who have been making this event possible. And we encourage you all to support them as well. And when you do, mention that you love their support of NOFA Mass and NOFA, all the organizations. I want to acknowledge that we are all viewing and presenting these workshops from land that was previously managed by Indigenous people before European colonization, and that we want to acknowledge that we all are occupying in previously inhabited land, and that you can take a moment to find your location and learn more about the people who were here before us on this great interactive map. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Faye and Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Sarah is going to share her screen in a moment, but as she does, just wanted to say hello. My name is Faye Mack. I am the Advocacy and Education Director at Hunger Free Vermont. We're a statewide anti-hunger nonprofit that covers the state of Vermont and work closely with similar types of organizations across the Northeast. So excited to see you all in the Northeast context. I'm also joined tonight by Sarah Danley. Sarah, do you want to say hi quickly and then I'll give a little overview of the session?
I'm Sarah Danley. I'm the network manager for the Vermont Farm to Plate Network, which is Vermont's statewide strategic food system initiative. So I help coordinate a number of the network groups, including one on food access, which is where this project work came from. And I will probably end up mentioning this later in the presentation, but I am also, as a volunteer, a member of my town's local planning commission. So I come at this topic from that perspective as well.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So to give everyone just a quick overview of what we're going to do today, we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. And so we're going to be really heavily trying to use the chat box. So we'll ask you a couple of questions sort of throughout the presentation and ask that you just type a quick answer of whatever comes to mind, just so we can kind of get a little, people can start to see what everyone is thinking about and where folks are coming from today. So we'll be using the chat box as much as we can. If you have questions or anything you want to share, please throw it into the chat box. We'll also pause a couple of times during our presentation portion of the workshop to answer any questions. But then we also have sort of a good chunk of time at the end for some facilitated dialogue where we're going to be asking you some different questions and also opening it up for conversation. And if we kind of move through those and still have some time left before the end of the workshop time, Sarah and I can both stay on and just sort of be part of a less formal conversation. It's always a little bit more formal feeling on this way, you know, sort of through Zoom than it is through a sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chats, through an in-person. So we're gonna do the best we can, and we also really appreciate feedback as we're trying to figure out how this session works in an online format. The other thing I want to say before we get started with the content too is to just acknowledge that both Sarah and I are coming from work in Vermont, and we know we're working with you all today in a broader context, and you're all coming from different parts of New England and the Northeast and maybe further on, who knows? We'll find out in a second. And so we are doing our best to sort of expand the way that we're talking about municipal planning and about food access, but our area of expertise really is in Vermont. And so if you have information about the place where you live that you think would be helpful for other people, we ask you to throw it into the chat box because all of the states in the Northeast are unique and municipalities are unique in the way that they govern and the way that they plan. So we look forward to learning from you all too. Okay. So as we get going, just before we start off, I'm going to share a little bit about what's going on for the session, but as we do, I'm hoping that folks can take to the chat box and introduce yourselves, where you are coming from today, what brings you to this. Are you here representing an organization? Are you here, what state are you from? If folks just want to introduce themselves in the chat box, we can all get a sense of who's here today. And as you do that, I'll tell you a little bit about what our presentation is going to consist of. So we will be talking with you all today about the intersection of local planning, municipal planning in your local towns and in your local counties and regions, and food access, and how municipal plans can be a great avenue for creating sustainable long-term approaches to ending hunger and to addressing food access at a really local level. And how in this period of COVID response, when a lot of communities are grappling with increased food insecurity, how the planning process can help sort of stabilize and make permanent some of the really great local solutions and local activities that are cropping up. So we'll be giving the goal of the session is to really have you all walk away feeling like you know a little bit more and you know where to go find out the information to the questions that you have. You will not leave this session feeling like an expert in food access, and you definitely won't feel it like an expert in municipal planning. So we'll be giving kind of a brief overview and introduction to both, but hope that we inspire you to go and learn a bit more about what's going on in your local community. So it looks like we have some folks from Massachusetts, from New Jersey. Sue is looking and getting more involved in food justice. It's great. Michael from Cleveland, Ohio, and also from Massachusetts. Great. It's great to see where folks are coming from. Welcome Nina from Somerville, Massachusetts. All of you seem like you're coming with really interesting sort of inspiration and motivation for being here tonight. So I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about those. All right. I am wondering, my last question before we get going, and please continue to introduce yourselves if you haven't. I can't see you all right now, so I don't even know how many people are on this. So I won't know when you're done introducing yourselves. But also, I'm interested if anyone has participated in their local town's government or municipal planning process in any way. Just a little yes or no. Some from Michael. No, not yet, Nina. I like your attitude there. Great. So it seems like folks are coming into this to learn a little bit about municipal planning, which is great. Okay, Sarah, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay, so great. Thank you all for continuing to add this into the chat box. I hope everybody is taking a look at that so we can all learn from each other as we go along. So I want to start out by just touching on two pretty important resources that we'll mention throughout the session. Each state has these different resources and partners in different ways. And the first are regional and municipal planning commissions. So each state likely divides up the way that they do planning in different ways. In Vermont, we have regional planning commissions, which may be a sub-political category of the state. They don't always align with counties or with sort of other political geographic boundaries. In Vermont, you can see the colors are different counties, and then our regional planning commissions are divided up a little bit differently, sort of bordering on mountains and multiple other counties. But these planning commissions are really important resources for you, especially if you are coming at this as a volunteer or just an interested community member who wants to learn how to utilize the planning process in your local municipal plan for addressing food access. Regional planning commissions are are organizations that are staffed with planning experts, and they're able to help, they help individual communities with writing grants, project management. They help communities actually write their municipal plans, and they're really sort of here to serve as your planning resource. They're a great place to go if you have questions about your local planning process. And you can find your local regional planning commission by going to the American Planning Association's website, the APA. I also want to mention, so at a municipal level, any incorporated municipality can have a plan and presumably has some form of local government that is engaged in planning. It might be in a really informal way, or it might be in a very formal way. In Vermont, some communities have paid planners, some have volunteer select board members who are learning about planning. Every community sort of approaches it from a different lens, and likely depends on how large your community is. But there are folks at a local level who are working on planning. Go to the next slide. So the other important partner, as you're getting going in this, that will be another important resource for you after this workshop, are different health partners. Food security is one of the social determinants of health, which are different factors, environmental factors, social factors, education, that impact someone's health. So housing and access to food are two examples of social determinants of health, of environmental factors that impact someone's health. And because of that, local health departments, state health departments, hospitals, different kinds of healthcare organizations are all increasingly concerned about social determinants of health, and have requirements to address them and to be working on them in some way. So they're a really great source for data, for financial support, for partners to take on planning projects with, and another important resource. So we'll touch on both of these different areas, the regional planning commissions and different health partners throughout, but really want to highlight them at the start as two important resources for you to just note as you go forward. Okay, so what brings us here today is a toolkit that Sarah and I and a number of different partners in Vermont helped develop over the last couple of years. The toolkit is available at the link that's at the bottom here, and you can type that in. You can also just go to vtfarmtoplate.com and you can find it pretty easily. We can also send around the link or put it in the chat box. Perhaps Sarah or Doug could help with that. But I will say that while we're sending you this link, don't go to it right now. Just copy it and put it somewhere for later, because you don't need to look through it in order to go through the workshop. And it's a really cool toolkit and you'll get totally distracted. But this is a toolkit for local planning for food access. So how to address food access through municipal plans that we've developed in Vermont through the Vermont Farm to Plate Network. The toolkit was developed with a combination of food access and food justice experts and planning experts. So we have folks from our Department of Health, from the regional planning commissions, local planners, volunteer planners, and then folks like me who are coming at this from a food security perspective. And we worked together over the course of a couple of years to develop a toolkit to help guide anybody who is at all interested in this topic through kind of the beginning stages of how they might address food access through their municipal plan. So the toolkit is, this is the table of contents. You can get a sense of what's in it. The toolkit is really meant to be accessible for everyone. So there's information about what food access means for folks who are coming at this issue maybe from a planning background. Maybe they're a municipal planner and somebody showed up at a town meeting saying, you know, we need to be addressing hunger in our community, and this is a great place for them to start. There's also some basics around municipal planning in Vermont, so that folks who are coming at this from a food access background can get a sense of what the planning process is. So we have some important background information. We have information in there about implementation, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but our goal really is for for the municipal plan not to be something that gets put on a shelf somewhere and gets dusty, that it's something that can be a guiding document, inspirational document, and a place to kind of to use to back up your projects, to say, look, this is what my town cares about. So we really want this to be put toward implementation. And then the toolkit goes through the different elements of a plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those different elements are. But municipal plans have different sections. There are some that, you know, are obvious probably as you think about what a town might be planning for, like land use, you know, transportation, its roads, things like that. And some others that you might not think of when you think of town planning. And the final thing I want to just alert you to in the toolkit and in the online webpage, if you go and look at that to download the toolkit, is that we know that the toolkit is an introduction. And so we've really stuck this toolkit and the website chock full with resources to support you. And while some of them are Vermont specific, a lot of them are transferable from state to state. So we don't think that this is really something that anybody can take on alone. We really will encourage you to find like-minded folks in your community who are also interested in this, but to also reach out to experts, including those regional planning commissions and health partners, but also your local community gardening association or your local anti-hunger organization and other folks who can help lend data and resources and other information that may be helpful. And so we have a lot of information about that in there. And even if you're not from Vermont, I encourage you to spend some time there. It will help give you guidance about kind of where to go next after you leave this workshop tonight. Okay, so next I want to just spend a few minutes sort of in line with the table of contents in our toolkit itself to talk a little bit about food access. A lot of folks are coming here today from different levels of understanding about food access. Maybe it's something that you are deeply involved in your local community, and maybe not. So to help us all have some foundational understanding together, what is food access? The definition on your screen: food access is accessible when it is affordable and community members can readily grow it or raise it, find it, obtain it, transport it, prepare it, and eat it. That food that people can access has to, in addition to being affordable and readily available, it also needs to be the kinds of food that work for that person and for their family. So culturally responsive food, food that that your family likes to eat, that people have choice and are able to access food with dignity are really key to someone having food access. So when we think about food access, it's all right now within the lens of coronavirus and what's been happening over the last 6 months or so in our country. And so one of the, there's a little bit of a question. Sarah and I and others kind of stepped back from our toolkit work a few months ago and wondered, is there something in this toolkit that we've been trying to, we were planning on putting out into the world this year anyways, that's really relevant right now? And what we've really seen in the food security world is that hunger has skyrocketed in response to the coronavirus pandemic. People were suddenly out of work overnight. Folks who had already been struggling were suddenly struggling more so than they had been. And a lot of people who have never struggled economically before were suddenly out of work or had reduced hours, or are trying to juggle working from home while also parenting and being an educator and caring for other family members and all the rest, which puts the strain on finances. So what you see here is sort of the change in food security that we had very suddenly from February into April and May. So in Rhode Island, for example, has a really dramatic spike from going from being the lowest source of food security, or lowest rate of food insecurity at 6.7% in February, all the way up to 22.1% in April, May. So that's a huge increase. And if you go to the next slide, Sarah, what you can see is sort of the trend of just how stark and remarkable this is. So this is specific to Vermont, but the trend lines look really similar for other states. After the Great Recession, we saw hunger decrease and then kind of steady out over the last couple of years. In Vermont, we've been about 1 in 10 Vermonters struggling to put food on the table for the last few years. And then you see that really sharp increase just between February and April and May. Hunger increased by 46% over those few months. And it's also at the highest point it ever has been in recent history, in decades and decades. So right now, hunger in Vermont, which is a little bit under 15%, is higher than it ever had peaked during the Great Recession. And we're seeing that in other states as well. In fact, Vermont still has one of the lower food insecurity rates in the country. So with that, you know, if we're dealing with this huge increase in hunger, and families and individuals are dealing with increased health stress and change of life and, you know, being out of work and everything else that's going on, why on earth should we really care about something like a town plan? And what we've seen in Vermont, and I'm assuming in other places as well, is that a lot of local communities have really stepped up to address the rise in hunger and that they're seeing in their community at a local level. We had schools suddenly shift the way they serve meals to serve meals remotely, to go where kids are and deliver them at their home. We've seen mutual aid groups pop up all over the state and have little free pantries right next to the little free libraries in their community, or host, you know, drop off and pick up sites for food, and trying to coordinate with farmers and the increased interest in CSAs and other access to local food. And we've seen supply chains get disrupted at a national level, and kind of the need for a really resilient regional food system has gotten more and more important. And so we've seen all these different kinds of projects crop up, and there's a lot of momentum and energy behind them. And at the same time, people are starting to get a little bit tired of the intense energy and momentum that's needed to keep all of this work going forward. And we need to start thinking about, you know, what happens in 6 months or 10 months. Food security sticks around, and we know that from the last recession. And so we expect hunger to keep getting worse. And so what we need to do is to start taking some of these really inspiring community-led projects and institutionalize them. And one of the best places to do that, to ensure it has long-term sustainable funding and is supported by the community, is through municipal plans. So that's a little bit about why now and why this is so important. The other area about what all of this has to do with communities and municipal planning is that there are a lot of decisions being made right now at the national level and at the state level about different programs and funding, but they're implemented in communities. So it can feel kind of far away when Congress is talking about increasing SNAP benefits, or the state is mandating different ways to serve school meals for children. But that all impacts right down at the local level. And town budgets, town plans, these are all different ways to help state values, state priorities, and to create structure and funding for programs like these as they're implemented on the ground.
All right. Thanks, Faye. So after that introduction to the hunger piece of this, I am going to go a little bit more into detail on the town plan, municipal planning 101 piece of this. Before I get started on that, I am curious, people can pop their answers into the chat, if anyone who's not a member of their town government has gone and read their town plan or municipal plan. And while folks are typing answers in, I will also apologize again that some of this started out as Vermont specific, and we've extrapolated it to the pieces that are relevant across all states. That said, we weren't able to get into the level of detail for every single New England state, let alone outside of New England. So again, we would really encourage you that if you're interested in pursuing planning for food access, one of the first steps would be to talk to your planning partners, whether that's your local town planning commission, your regional planning commission, other professional planners that you may happen to know, because they would also be able to answer any questions for you on the details of how planning as a profession applies to your state in particular. That said, so what is a town plan? It's a visionary and it's a regulatory document. So it's a visionary document for all aspects of what a town would like to see happen. So technically towns are not usually required to have a town plan, at least in Vermont, but there are usually benefits attached. In Vermont, for example, having a town plan is required if you want to have zoning ordinances. In any state, even if it's not required, it would certainly be the process of how you get to the zoning ordinances, for example. It strengthens applications, and in some cases, it's required to have a town plan to be eligible for some grant programs, which can be really helpful when you get to that implementation phase of trying to get funding for food access projects. And in some cases, the town plan may have additional legal teeth under some other state legislation. So Vermont, for example, has a statewide development review process. And if a town has an approved town plan, the statewide review process defers to that plan whether the development is in conformance with the plan. So there's some teeth at the state level as well. So again, all those specifics would vary by your state, but there might be a number of different ways where your town plan is not only visionary, but has some additional beneficial aspects as well, from getting you funding to helping trigger some teeth and other aspects of the law. In Vermont, there's also regulations on what must be included in the town plan in order for it to be an approved plan. So in Vermont, that includes sections on land use, transportations, natural resources, education, energy, housing, economic development, and flood resilience. That said, municipalities are able to have a plan that doesn't include all of those elements. It just won't necessarily be an approved town plan. So again, it just gets into the exact details of your state legislation of what gets you qualified as an approved town plan for those other benefits. But your town has a lot of flexibility to do what works for your situation. I do just want to add that this toolkit is also, while focusing on approved official municipal plans, we're really encouraging food access to be considered in the context of other community planning as well. Some communities in Vermont, for example, have done a separate food access plan that's not necessarily going through the official regulatory process for their town plan. There's a few other examples from around New England. Shelburne Farms, Massachusetts, partnered with the Conway School and did a food resilience plan. That's a really interesting model that I encourage you to check out. There's a few nonprofits that can support communities in doing that type of informal planning work, such as in Vermont, we have the Vermont Council on Rural Development. I'm sure there's similar nonprofits in other states. The Orton Family Foundation is based in Vermont, but actually works nationwide. And again, your area's planning partners would probably know who those people are who can help facilitate other community planning processes. Another one just to mention is the EPA and USDA have a joint program called Local Food, Local Places, where they will come into your community and provide technical assistance and do a local food access planning process with your community. So there are, I think, about a dozen communities a year, and that's nationwide, but that's something to look at as well if you're looking for technical assistance in doing some sort of process. So this is just a graphic showing the rough outline of the planning process. I'll let you read it yourselves, but the main point of this graphic is a reminder that it's an iterative cycle. The plan is a living document, and you're constantly cycling through the process as your information, your community circumstances, and your community's goals change. So town plans can take as little as 4 or 5 months to create and then officially adopt, or they can take several years. Your state likely has a statute for how frequently it must be updated to be an approved plan. In Vermont, it's 8 years, but we really believe that there's always a good time to approach the Planning Commission because it's an iterative cycle and it always needs to be a continuous update. Like if you're in the middle of a cycle and your town plan was just adopted 2 years ago, that might actually be a really great time to approach your Planning Commission because then they'll have actually more time to dive into a new topic than food access than when it's 1 year from their plan expiring and they're rushing to meet the deadline. There's always a good time. And once adopted, it's a good practice to conduct an annual review of the implementation strategies and to determine what steps to focus on in the coming year. So that's another role that advocates could play with their local planning commission is just like talk to your planning commission members, see what they're doing in the interim between writing plans and whether they're actually tracking implementation of the steps that were put into the plan. Again, we can't emphasize strongly enough, you don't have to go this alone. Pretty much every area in New England has regional support. There's a lot of excellent resources out there too. So Farm to Plates, I will say, is geared towards small and rural communities, because when we were developing it, we felt like that was the gap in the available support. There are a lot of really wonderful resources out there that are focused on really large urban centers for doing food access planning. One of the best ones is a project called Growing Food Connections. It's out of University of Buffalo, I believe, and they have a ton of amazing resources on food systems planning and food access planning. So I highly recommend you check them out. There's also a lot of grant support out there for the planning process. Your state likely has some, at least Vermont does. And as previously mentioned, there's some private foundations that can either provide financial assistance or technical assistance as well. So you don't have, even if your town planning commission is comprised of volunteers, you don't have to dive into this whole process completely unsupported and relying just on volunteer labor. There's this whole field out there that might have some support for you. So I referenced this briefly before, but wanted to give you a little bit more of a context for what types of content would be included in a municipal plan. So these are the plan elements that Vermont lists out in statute, but these would be common plan elements based on planning paradigms, no matter where you're located. So common plan elements would include making sure to highlight objectives, policies, and programs. A land use, which is usually a narrative as well as a map that actually maps out the different land use designations, which is what leads you to be able to enact a zoning ordinance. Transportation, which likewise would be a statement and a map. Utilities and facilities, education, energy, economic development, housing, flood resilience, policies on preserving rare natural areas, compatibility with adjacent municipalities and regions, and then your actual implementation program. Really important to remember is that this outline of what should be included, or your comparable outline from any other state statute, is guidelines and might be required for what has to be in the plan, but at least in Vermont, it doesn't have to be arranged this way. So you have to address all of these elements, but you can be creative in how you combine them. For example, if you really feel that agriculture should be addressed as well as preserving rare natural areas, you're free to combine different sections of the plan and come up with a way that an outline that works for your community. This is just another framework, again, coming from Vermont statute, but helpful context and language for any area. These are planning goals. So as well as the previous slide, which was specific topics, this is acknowledging that even the smallest town is a really complex system. So you have to deal with many interlocking issues and goals. And I won't read through all of those, but I would like to point out that many of these do overlap with food access, such as encouraging and strengthening agriculture and forest industries, strategies to protect long-term viability of agriculture and forest lands, the manufacture and marketing of value-added agriculture and forest products, use of locally grown food products, etc. And we've referenced this before, the importance of implementation. Implementation is the most important part of the plan, and it's often the most overlooked. So we are going over the course of this presentation to show a few examples of ways to make your plan actually actionable for improving food access. And the way plans are often set up is with goals, objectives, policies, and actions. So goals state a purpose and a destination. They should reflect a shared vision for the community, but not be so vague that they're open for interpretation. A great place to start is looking at your statewide planning goals and copy that language into your town plan as you see fit and appropriate. Objectives then are targets for reaching your goal. So they need to be smart enough that you know when you've attained it. SMART in this case is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. Policies then are the courses of action that your town will adopt to obtain the objective, and not every goal actually needs a policy. Actions then are concrete, discrete steps that need to be taken to attain the objective. So that's like the level of detail of identifying who will do it, when, how they'll do it, and if there's programs in place, including grant funding mechanisms. And sorry for such a high level, quick run through the whole concept of municipal planning, but we just want to get a few of these ideas and vocabulary because we'll be coming back to them in some food access specific examples very soon. So looking back at this list of common plan elements, we're curious what ideas this group might have, and you can just pop your answers into the chat box for which of these elements might have a connection for food access. Which of these sections might be a place to address food access in your municipal plan? What are people's thoughts? So we're getting education and transportation, yep. And those are both ones, yep. So education, transportation, utilities and facilities, land use, housing, economic development. Absolutely. So those are all sections that we do address in the toolkit as having a potential connection with food access. So we are going to go through a couple of them now, and then if you're curious about the rest of the ones that we've identified and the examples of how to integrate food access there, feel free to check out the toolkit for a few others. This table is just, and we have a more full version of the table in the toolkit as well, but this table really is meant to illustrate that there's a lot of different strategies you can use to address food access, and there's a lot of different places you can put those strategies. So really it's just a question of finding what makes the most sense for your community based on your community priorities, what you already have in the plan, et cetera. For example, if you're interested in supporting new food retailers, it could go in economic development or in land use. Establishing a community garden could go in a number of different plan sections as well. So there's sort of two different strategies as you're deciding what to pursue. You can either think of a strategy that you know you want to do, and then you have multiple options where to put in the plan. Or if you, for example, know that you're updating your land use chapter now, even though you won't be touching the rest of your plan for another couple of years, you could think of it in terms of in that order and say, like, what strategies would be appropriate for a land use chapter. And I will also just say that some towns do really amazing food security plans, like standalone food security plans or food resilience plans. There's a lot of wonderful examples of that out there too. And when we started this project, we actually anticipated pushing for that more, like holding that up as the gold standard. But over the course of the 3 years we were developing this project and working with food access advocates and professional and volunteer planners, we actually came to the conclusion that it can be just as powerful and maybe even more powerful in some cases to integrate food access throughout the whole plan rather than having it as a separate section, which can be harder to get buy-in from new partners. That's sort of like setting you up as a silo with only people who are already bought into food access or participating in that process. It could be easier, especially if it's a separate plan, not just a chapter of your official plan. It could be easier to set it aside on a shelf and forget it. So it can certainly be done really well and really powerful, but we do strongly encourage you incorporating food access throughout the town plan in as many different sections as you feel is relevant for your community's specific circumstances. And now I will hand it back to Faye to start us off with some examples of food access strategies for these different sections.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So yeah, so Sarah and I are going to spend a little bit of time now just sharing a couple of the different elements and how you might actually address some food access issues through them. So the first one we wanted to talk about is agriculture and or economic development. It could be the way we're thinking about this, it could kind of sit in either. So we're just going to talk about them together. But there are things like the loss of local retail and shuttering of Main Street, which is particularly relevant right now, actually. We came up with this example pre-COVID, but feels really relevant right now. And as retail has lost at the local level and folks have shifted more to big box stores and online shopping, there has been a growing and serious concern on the impact of how residents can access fresh and local food, especially those who may live in more urban centers and have access to limited transportation. So the town's plan for economic development strategies can identify ways to reinvigorate small and local commercial enterprises, to help existing corner stores provide more healthy food, such as fresh produce. So if the issue is not that there is no grocery store, but that there are a lot of bodegas and corner stores, how can they better serve folks' needs? and exploring different opportunities like that, which can help the local agricultural community, and it can also help economic development and help ground, you know, those kind of main stores in a downtown that anchor stores, that's what they're called, like grocery stores. So if that were something that, you know, if that were a strategy that would really help in your community, there's some process to take in order to explore that. You know, first think about whether local agriculture or economic development is a frame that would resonate more in your given community, depending on what people get excited about and what people are passionate about. Talk to local business owners and do an inventory of what is going on. So, for example, this has happened recently in Washington County, which is one of the counties in Vermont, where we did an inventory of what kind of food retail was available, because one of the communities there is notorious for being a higher population community that has no grocery store. And we wanted to see, like, what is that problem? How does that manifest itself? And discovered that there are a lot of local food stores that could just ramp up a little bit about what they're purchasing and what they're selling. Get data on wages, income, employment patterns, assess demographic information, the needs of different populations, take a look at any kind of state level data that you have about understanding the economic gap in your community, assess what food is currently being retailed in your town, and identify different business opportunities. So that would be some of the process that you might take to gather information and to build some support and build some partners in this effort. And then you would move into action and identify, are there incentives that are needed for new business owners? Are there ways to support public-private partnership? And for the plan to address that. Are there processing, storage, or retail barriers for local producers? Like, is it really hard to get around zoning laws for farms to be able to offer direct to consumer sales, or other zoning that might be making it difficult to bring in different kinds of food retail? How could a plan shift in order to encourage that kind of development? And to share just an example of how this has happened in real life. So, so throughout the toolkit, we have different case studies and examples of what's been happening in different parts of Vermont. Most communities in Vermont do not address food access in their municipal plan, but a lot of communities are doing really exciting things that could totally fit into a municipal plan. So our case studies are highlighting those kinds of examples. So there's a town in Vermont, Albany, Vermont, that has been without a general store. It's a small town, so a general store is kind of the level of food retail that would be available there. But they've been without a general store for more than 6 years when there was a fire in the building. So the town of Albany's first ever town plan recommended village center designation, which is a tax incentive for owners to make improvements to income producing properties. And it can be a powerful economic engine. In order to obtain village center designation, the community has to have a town plan that has been approved by the Regional Planning Commission. So they went through the process to develop this village center designation, and then the Albany Community Trust purchased the closed general store and received a $55,000 tax credit. So they've received a tax credit, had an incentive in order to purchase that place. They've raised more than $400,000 and have received help from other supports in order to reopen the store and to start that. And the municipal plan was a really important catalyst in order to create those opportunities and to drive that momentum forward in that community.
Great. So the next section we wanted to highlight a little bit is just the land use and transportation. And I will also say that if there's duplication of strategies between these slides, it is because a lot of these strategies could go in multiple different sections and whatever makes the most sense for your community. So land use is one of the first things that people think of when they think of town planning, and it really is important for food access as well. I'll talk a little bit specifically about land use, and then note transportation and why we decided to throw it in with the land use slide. So when you're evaluating land uses in your community, the intent of a town plan is to not just think of the land uses you have today, but also future uses that are likely to happen or desirable in your community. So it's a process to think about, where will new housing development occur? Where are the commercial and civic centers? Are there large tracts of agriculture and forestry land still? Are there natural constraints to development? Because you're also looking forward to future land use patterns in the process of developing this section of the town plan, it's also really important to consider unintended consequences of your land use plan in general, but especially in food access. So for example, a really well-intentioned restriction on commercial development might 10 years down the line prevent an urgently needed food retailer from opening. So one of the things we really encourage people to do when they're working with food access and land use is to look at some potential unintended consequences. Transportation, we do have it as a separate section in our guide, but for the purposes of this presentation, we did combine the two, and that's because at the intersection of food access, they often address the same issue, which is, can people get to the food retail stores? So your land use section might include things like, where is that future housing development? Is it mixed use with mixed retail? Will new housing developments be within walking distance of food access retail points or farms? And then the inverse of that is, no, if it's not within walking distance, will at least be accessible by public transportation. The two often do go hand in hand, and transportation can sometimes be the fix for land use patterns that if you've already developed to the point where things aren't walkable, then it's really, really important to think about public transportation for food access. So in terms of going through the process of thinking through these simultaneously, of course, it's really important to evaluate your existing, but again, also your potential development patterns using geographic information systems, and any professional planning support in your area would have access to those databases and be able to crunch those numbers for you. It's a great idea to identify community development partners. For example, would a Main Streets organization be interested in a partnership to create more retail points, more walkability, more community dinners, etc.? Smart growth and compact development are really important topics in the planning world, even outside of food access. So there's a lot of potential allies there if you're thinking about walkability to food access points. In terms of policy, it's important to make sure that the plan and any affiliated zoning supports food retail, but not just food retail. Thinking holistically about food access, we also want to look at value-added processing, farmland preservation, and again, the linkages between housing, transportation, and retail. Some potential actions within your land use and transportation plan other than just zoning. Again, obtaining community development designations like the village center designation that Faye just gave the example of on the previous slide, which could allow you to access funding for projects such as retail, and working with your transportation partners to assess the transportation routes in comparison with food retailers. We had a project in Vermont where a local regional planning commission partnered with some food advocates to actually map out food retail points and the transportation routes to see where things weren't really accessible and how that could be improved through the transportation plan.
So another area of planning that a lot of folks think of first when they think of planning is utilities and facilities. It often plans for public buildings, services, and infrastructure like water, sewer, and solid waste handling. That's sort of at the core of it, but it also can and should be expanded to address food shelves, congregate meal sites, community gardens, and other sorts of ways to address food access that require a space and infrastructure behind it. Solid waste also has an important food access connection. It's estimated that anywhere from 25% to 40% of the food that is grown, processed, and transported in our country will never be consumed. And instead, in most parts of the country, it then ends up in the landfill where it produces methane, and according to the EPA, is 21 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So it's important from multiple perspectives, including a climate change perspective, to be addressing food waste at a local level. And there are many opportunities sort of within the food waste world to be also addressing food access and access to fresh fruits and vegetables in particular. So there are different ways to, again, kind of approach this process. We recommend that you reach out and talk to food access groups, service providers like organizations that run congregate meal sites, local community garden groups, or folks who might be interested in establishing a community garden, your local food shelf, and other different folks like that, and water districts as well. Many communities also have a gleaning organization. So in Vermont, we have a lot of different kind of locally regionalized gleaning collectives, and then a Vermont Gleaning Collaborative, which kind of serves as an umbrella to organize amongst all of them. And many other states have these different organizations, or they're getting off the ground right now. So reach out to those folks as well. And also get information about municipal budget. That's important kind of throughout in all of these different elements, but particularly here, you know, taxes pay for things like utilities and facilities. And so understanding how your community is spending its money on these issues is a really helpful start. When you go through that process, you'll identify different actions to take, and some might be to make improvements to a food shelf. You know, can folks get to it? Again, it goes back to transportation and land use. But what other kind of infrastructure needs does that food shelf have? Can it process food in order to take in extra food from farmers and turn it back around for folks to eat? Create an asset map of what's happening in the community, and do some work with your gleaning organization or others if there is no gleaning organization to connect surplus food to those who need it. We have this reverse pyramid here on the screen too, just to highlight Vermont it just went into effect earlier this month, our universal recycling and composting law. So at this point, it's been kind of ramping up to July 1st this year, when all Vermonters now are required to compost, and it can't go into landfill anymore. So as we've been gearing up for that, this hierarchy of need is something that our state has been using about where to send food so that it doesn't go to a landfill, kind of starting with source reduction, minimizing waste, getting food to people. So that's from a food access perspective, and then down to food to animals, and so on and so forth. A lot of different states and communities are starting to look at this as well. So we left that in there as something that might be useful in your community as well. And an interesting way to think about unlikely partners like waste districts and other different utility and facility organizations who don't normally interact in a food access sphere, but really can and have the opportunity to through this sort of plan. One of the ways that that's been happening in Vermont is in the northeastern part of the state, the solid waste handling infrastructure has been really working to address food access through reducing food waste. So just what we were talking about. But they were able to receive a grant from USDA Rural Development to explore how to establish a sustainable food recovery network for the whole northeastern region, which is a very rural part of our state. And so they're working to establish a best practice model for that second line in the hierarchy of getting food to people by redistributing rescued food, which is something that has been proven very successful in more urban areas. And so they're trying to take those best practices and transfer it to a rural area. So that's the kind of example of a project that could come from this work.
So then the last sort of like plan section that we did want to highlight tonight is health and wellness. And this is actually not a super traditional plan element. It's actually not yet required in Vermont, but a number of professional planners, including a lot of the ones we've been partnering on, have been involved in a push to get municipalities to voluntarily add a health and wellness section to their town plan. It's really exciting for food access once communities add this section, because any food access initiative is a health project. Thinking back to those social determinants of health and the role that food plays, basically any food access strategy that we've discussed or that you could think of putting in your town plan could also be included in a health and wellness plan, because ultimately it is about health. So that does, again, get back to the health partners as being a really key partners to approach early on, to see if there's any efforts already underway from their profession to try and incorporate health in general into municipal planning processes, and forming an alliance with them and working to coordinate those efforts. Again, they can also provide health trends. State Department of Health would have a lot of data. There's likely local offices for your State Department of Health as well. Your local hospital will probably have some food access and food security resources through their required community health needs assessment that they're required to do. And in our toolkit, in the appendix especially, we do have a number of other resources and data sources specific to the food and health connection. Again, pretty much any food access action could be included in this section. Some that we like to highlight because because health is a particularly good place to put these strategies if they don't fit as well in other sections of the plan, are supporting alternative transportation to core areas. So the transportation plan often is more like permanent, traditional public transportation. And if you're working on community projects, like a nonprofit that runs a van for senior citizens, so you do shopping trips, for example, if that's hard to fit in your more traditional transportation section, that could go in a health and wellness plan. Supporting specific existing community efforts such as Meals on Wheels, or any other similar food access efforts that you want your town to support more officially, or even to provide funding for through a town budget. It can be good to work into the town plan, and the health section is a great option. Urban and community gardening, another great one. Community gardening, especially if there's not an economic or for-profit business involved, some towns might be resistant to the idea of putting it in an economic development section, which is why that's another great one to consider for a health and wellness section. And then nutrition education too, might fit in your education section, might fit in utilities and facilities if it's run through a library or some other town institution. But if you can't find another place for it, definitely consider a health and wellness section to your plan. And I think that wraps up our examples of how to incorporate food access. We do want to take some time to have a discussion with you, and we have some discussion prompts. But before we get into that, we did want to provide a couple minutes for any clarifying questions. So if you have any questions that you want to pop into the chat box, we'll try to answer as many as we can.
Sarah, you can unshare your screen at this point, and then we can all see each other too, which will help. And for folks that don't have their cameras on, feel free to turn them on if you want. And drop a question in the chat box. We're a smaller group too, so if you have a clarifying question or anything, a question about what we just presented, you can feel free to just wave and we'll call on you as well. Now, Stephen.
Where's my...
You're on, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I couldn't find it on my screen.
That's okay.
My question was, there's a lot here on quantity and making sure people have access and so on, but is there some, at any point, is there some overlay to encourage organic foods, which is, of course, intimately tied in with health?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there is definitely, as you think about it from the agricultural and land use, sort of especially from the agricultural perspective, in that section that I was sharing some examples of, there's opportunity to promote, you know, different land use and the way that what kind of food is coming to people. Sort of separately, the Vermont Farm to Plate Network has also developed some toolkits about that relate to municipal planning that are a little bit more geared toward agriculture sector and toward land use and farming, and that I think has a little bit more in there that might be helpful to that. But from a consumption perspective, you know, and Sarah was just talking about examples about how to incorporate nutrition education or community gardening and some of those different opportunities to both to merge kind of nutrition and cooking education along with food access. And I think that's probably where you're going to find your most ability to do that.
Yeah, well, it's so important. I mean, I cringe. I mean, I've dealt with hospitals, for example, that are oncology centers, and they're feeding foods that are laced with glyphosate, which is a carcinogen, or other pesticides that are carcinogens. So it's, I think it's critical.
Yeah. One other thing I would add, and this isn't explicitly about organic, but from the perspective of supporting local small-scale agriculture, one thing we've discovered in our conversations with health professionals at Farm to Plate is that if you're interested in supporting local agriculture and you're talking to, for example, a federally qualified health center, your local healthcare provider, they are less interested in the argument about local food being healthier. There's not necessarily enough data in their minds to believe that, but
Right.
they totally are on board with support. They're totally on board with supporting local farmers via the argument that it's their client's livelihood, and thinking back to that social determinants of health model and the economic impacts on health. So they actually can be really great allies for the local food movement, but it's a matter of framing it to them and framing it as being about supporting your clients, your community's economy and economic impact on health, rather than getting into an argument about whether local food is inherently healthier than industrial food from the Midwest, if that makes sense. So a lot of this planning work is really sort of like figuring out what language will resonate with the partners the partnerships that you're trying to develop and the people that you're speaking with.
Right. Okay.
What other questions do folks have? Or anything kind of that we said that you thought, oh, it's different in Massachusetts than it is in Vermont, that you want to share with the rest of the group?
Hi, this is Lynn.
Lynn.
I'm from New Jersey, but what I've noticed in traveling in New York, they have a very good regional system in terms of getting their local farmers, and what they have done in all of the highway rest stops. They allow farmers to come in from their local communities and sell their wares, and they promote it. And I was just like, this is such a great thing. Why don't we do that in New Jersey? Because it gets people to be interested in good local foods, and it's a perfect place to have people, because they're going in to get stupid Wendy's, and I don't mean that, but you know, unhealthy.
You're correct.
Foods, that you could get better food, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
Good-
I think that's
good thought.
I think that's a really nice example, Lynn, of, you know, essentially the state of New York has decided that they are willing to allow kind of an unconventional business model at rest stops. So that could be something at a more community level that you could think about. Is there a unique and different place for a farmer's market that actually would reach a different audience? You know, and what needs to happen in terms of allowing that to be there? You know, that's just one of those examples, a really nice example of meet people where they are. You know, folks are already stopping at the rest stop. It's a great way to bring guests and tourists into the state, into understanding that there is local food here, and this might be something interesting to check out. So how that might transfer into your own community, and then what the barriers are, you know, if there are any kind of zoning or infrastructure barriers there.
Yeah, where I live, I'm very close to a Patterson, which is a very hard hit community in terms of a food desert. And we've lost at least 2 major shopping grocery stores in our area. And it's like, these people don't have transportation to go, and they don't have, you know, they don't have access to the food stores anymore. And it's really now, it was supposed to come in, but you know, it's like all that's going to be put on hold for who knows how long, you know. And it's a shame, because people just don't have a place to go to get good food.
Sure. Yeah. So Nina, I'm seeing your question in the chat box about any models for corporate support for these kinds of projects. I think I'm interested, Sarah, in what you think about that, but what comes to mind when I think about opportunities for corporate support is really in kind of two levels. One is at the implementation level. Funding is always one of the biggest, if not always the biggest barrier for actions to actually be able, strategies to turn into a project that is both that is able to both be funded to like get off the ground, but then also to sustain. And that's where town budgets can come into play. A lot of municipal budgets might help fund ongoing programs like Meals on Wheels or food shelves, but also how can local business also support these different kinds of activities that are really helpful. Other ways too are just around how corporate entities support their employees around, providing them with resources and information about how to access programs like SNAP or coupon programs like it's called Crop Cash in Vermont, but different programs that help double your bucks at farmers markets. Different things like that, paying a livable wage, all of that is really, really key from a corporate perspective. But I think also when we think about kind of some of the zoning and the land use questions, there are opportunities for businesses to really support mixed use development in their neighborhood, or to support, a bus stop, making sure there's a bus stop on the block where there's the grocery store, bike parking, different things like that. Having other business support is really key, and they can be a really powerful and unique partner in this kind of work.
I would just add two quick things. One might be extremely specific to Vermont, being that it's so rural and with a low population. One is that we've seen corporations, businesses playing a big role in transportation-based projects. So often companies up here in Vermont, they are suffering, their workforce is facing the same transportation challenges as people who need to get food access. So companies are interested in supporting public transportation or alternate transportation models too. So again, that might be more specific to a more rural context, but probably helpful in some places outside of Vermont as well. I think the other thing, just speaking this time with my hat of being a volunteer planner in my own community, we're a very small town, it's 2,500 people. There's one large employer in it, and they are pretty supportive of generalized economic development efforts because they realize that for their own business to remain viable, to have employees, to have customers, they need more economic development, especially things that are supportive of young people. So in working with them on economic development, it really has been more languages finding that common ground of how to describe the challenges that everyone in the community is facing and recognizing that they want to strengthen the community as well. So it's a matter of like, I don't know how well it would go for us to walk into their office and say like, oh, we need to fix food access in our town, but framing it as economic development, and we know food access is one of the big challenges in our area, I think would have a lot better response.
Great, so why don't we go ahead and move on to discussion. So Sarah and I have a couple of different discussion prompts for folks. We'll hope you use the chat box to answer, and we can kind of grab some of them and move them into verbal discussion too, if that's helpful. And our goal here is to help you all think a little bit about like, how can you start to think about taking this into your own community and begin this work. So to start, as you're hearing all of these different ideas and the strategies and the processes that are coming up, what kinds of challenges do you anticipate you might face if you began working through this process in your own community? And what kind of suggestions would you have for to kind of overcome that challenge or other challenges that other people might be facing? And just, don't overthink it. Whatever comes to your mind first, drop it in the chat box. We can see where folks are thinking. Finding enough volunteers. Yes, Vivian, definitely. I think that all communities struggle with kind of long-term engagement, and that is definitely key to kind of bringing it to local politics, entrenched, resistant to new models. Politics. Nina, I appreciate the way you're thinking about from a business perspective, that there's different entry points and different ways to, you know, so for others who are thinking about a large employer or other businesses in their town, there's different ways to kind of build businesses into volunteers and to support for you, both from funding, but also working with farms, working as a partner and a voice, and just saying this is important. Government funding. Sarah, coming from your perspective as doing this at a volunteer local level, you have any thoughts about sort of the volunteer barrier, or just how to kind of bring it to your community with its local politics and its funding strapped?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a challenge. I do think looking for any funding sources that are out there to help with the planning process can be a real benefit. And one of the services that your regional professional planners, whatever that looks like in your state, might be able to provide is actually doing a lot of the work for you if you can get funding for them. That's really how it works in Vermont. There's a state grant to provide planning funding that most towns choose to give to their regional planning commission to help them develop the plan for them. Because they're really, it does become quite a lot of work, even just during the planning process, let alone the implementation. I will also say that I do think COVID and the surge in interest in food security is a real opportunity to find volunteers to do this work, especially for local food. People are thinking more about food security, and they're also thinking more about local small-scale food production too. I had never had certain branches of my town government, I had never had think about food access or even much about local farming before. And as soon as COVID hit, that's all they're talking about. It's what our business network is talking about. The key is just like tap into that now and leverage it for work in the future. Oh, there was one other thing I was going to say, and I completely forgot what it was. Oh, I guess also just, again, like looking in unexpected places for that help. If you're not finding enough volunteers through the normal channels, like it might be that your town planning commission or your on the ground food access group, like a church group, is completely strapped for volunteers. And there might be some unusual suspects who would leap at the chance to get involved, especially now. That could be a matter of finding a different company that is interested in supporting food access now and using them as volunteers to supplement the pool of people who always help at the church food access event. In terms of planning, it could mean, for example, looking through a different set of volunteers in your town. Our community garden is running a food access initiative, and instead of going through our planning commission, they're actually going through the recreation commission. And they're interested in it because it's outdoor recreation community space. So finding creative avenues to find more volunteers to help. Yeah, so Nina, to your question, Vermont has a state grant that covers planning work. So the town applies for the state grant, and then they can use it themselves if they want, but most of them use it to pay their regional planning commission staff to do the work. So the regional planning commission sort of plans ahead to plans a certain amount of time in order to be able to dedicate to community projects like that. And I know that that model is true elsewhere in New England as well, from a couple of experiences I've had around New England. I don't know how widespread it is, but that is the case in other places as well, where the regional entity will plan a certain amount of time to help the communities.
Great, thanks, Sarah.
And, Nina, you're in Somerville, right? You're within the area of the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, and they do actually have a public health position there, and that person, I believe, is interested in working or already working on food access. So that would be a great contact for you.
So what kinds of questions do you have about food access in your town that you might need to go collect more information or data on, or a new partner who you might need to reach out to build a new connection as you think about building a case to bring to your municipal planning commission? What kinds of questions do you have or information you want to go find?
I guess you would have to look at the demographics and what people want in terms of their food. I mean, because there's like, I'm in a very diverse area, and you know, there's a lot of differences in terms of what people eat in, you know, what they want. I see that in our farmers markets, and it's very diverse, and it's very interesting, you know. So I guess look at the demographics and find out what people want, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. A really great point. And Vivian is mentioning exploring how to involve schools. That's another really good point. I think that's also been driven home during COVID of how important schools are for children and families, you know, their food access, their health, their social connections, much more than just their basic education, for sure. Other things you might need to go find out? Maybe exploring, you know, if there is a community, if there is a community garden, how active it is, who's involved in it, how much does it cost to take part in that community garden? Is it accessible to folks where it is? I know in a lot of more rural areas, especially community gardens, have this tendency to pop up in a field, sort of, you know, 5 miles outside of town in a place that might not be really accessible if you don't have a car. You know, if there isn't a community garden, or if there isn't a food shelf, why not? One of the things that we run into a lot in Vermont is just saturation of different kinds of venues like food shelves or farmers markets, where really not every individual community needs all of those, you know, needs their own farmers market or needs their own food shelf. There are opportunities to collaborate, which can help save money and reach different economies of scale. So maybe, you know, are there unmet needs, you know, going and asking folks about that to identify it before you get involved in a project.
I would just add also going to talk to, especially since this is the NOFA conference, talking with your local farmers. They'll often know who's able to access the food, especially the direct-to-consumer ones or the ones who are selling at farmers markets. Hearing from them their sense of what community members are accessing the food, and also what the barriers are to that, what barriers they're seeing in being able to offer their product to more members of their community. You know, most local farmers, especially direct to consumer, are doing it because they want to feed their neighbors, and they might be able to tell you immediately what the barrier is, whether it's no processing or storage, no, zoning doesn't allow distribution points, they're just forced to offer prices too high, and then there might be programs where you can help subsidize their produce, that sort of thing. So definitely chatting with your farmers right away.
There was something in New York City that I learned recently in terms of people plugging in refrigerators on the street and then filling it with free food, and it would just be gone within, you know, a couple hours. And every day, you know, that was, I'm like, wow, you know, that's a really interesting way, because a lot of people can't get to places, you know, and they don't have the transportation, but to be able to have refrigerators on the streets that people can access to get free food, I was like, this is a great idea. And it was just a pop-up that happened because of COVID.
Yeah, that's a really great example too of some of the really unique, very localized efforts that have cropped up in response to COVID that have the opportunity to become more sustained. Clearly there's a gap that's been identified in that process. There are a lot of, I live in Burlington, Vermont area, and there are a lot of little free pantries is what they're calling them, but similar, but not refrigerated, that have been cropping up. And so I went around as the anti-hunger person and made sure that they all had SNAP information so that folks could sign up for long-term benefits in addition to getting that need met in the short term. So how you can take efforts like that and think about how to sustain them, because energy peters out if there isn't energy often peters out if it's fully kind of run by one person who had a really great idea, and then 6 months later it's a lot to sustain. So bringing it to a full community level to make sure there's support behind that is a really great way to keep things going too. So as we kind of near toward about 5 or 6 minutes left, and we have a little bit of kind of wrap up information to share with you all. I'm curious about next steps that folks are considering. Is there anything that you're leaving here thinking that I'm going to go do this later in the week? Any next step that you think you might take? Reading the toolkit, that's a great next step, Sue. Thank you. Great, yeah, go check out your local city plan. See what's in it. I'd be really interested to know as people go do it, if anyone sees anything about food access too. We've taken a pretty close look at a lot of the plans in Vermont, but not outside of Vermont. So I'd be really curious if you find a good example of something around food access, please send it back our way. Yeah, attend your regional school board meeting. It's a great place to go start asking some questions.
Yeah, and food and ag education is so important too. We could do a whole other session on the connection between that and food access and local farming. So I'm really glad you bring that up.
Sarah, do you want to show your last slide with some next steps?
Yep. So you all got the main ones, but some potential next steps that we've identified. Just reading your plan if you haven't yet, and we do really encourage you to reach out to your town planning commission or select board or any other commissions that might be relevant in your town to sort of gauge where they are at politically. You guys all identified the politics as a key challenge to all this, and a lot of that will come from a conversation with your local planners and neighbors, not necessarily through reading the document. It's important really early on to talk to other local food access partners like the food shelf, the school, regional partners, local retailers like community stores, farmers markets, and farms in general, as I was mentioning. If you already have a project in mind, I would recommend you start by thinking about potential allies based on other town goals like economic development. So is there a hook to your proposed project to get economic development stakeholders on board, or education stakeholders, or health partners? And then again, just looking into funding to do this planning work can be really helpful early on to avoid some of that volunteer fatigue that people were raising as a potential challenge. So that's what we have for first steps. And we also put both of our contacts there, so we're happy to hear from you and chat more if you want to reach out with any questions or let us know what you're working on.
Yeah, please. I don't have anything else, just to say thank you all for your time this evening. Thank you, NOFA, for figuring out a way to keep this going when we can't all be there in person.
Yes, we are so appreciative of you presenting and offering this great information and insight. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining the NOFA Mass community.